We are continuing with the causes of decay of cultural property. In our last lecture, we have talked about the natural causes, and today we will continue with that, but some other aspects. This is biological and botanical causes. If you can see this beautiful structure, a small temple near Bishnupur in West Bengal. It's the terracotta temple, all the carvings and other things are more or less intact, but it looks very dark, and there are several reasons for that, which apparently is not only cleaning, but there are far more other causes which are contributing to this look of this temple. So, these are mainly comes under the biological and botanical causes, which and we ascribe to the animals, birds, insects, trees and plants, fungi, molds and lichens. So, this is some things under, and also the algae and moss, and there are various types of them, various categories of them. We will broadly take a look of these many major aspects and which cause, and maybe some of the remedial measures or preventive measures, just to have an idea that what are these major causes of biological and botanical factors which deteriorate or cause damage to the historical structure. Let us first talk about the animals. Animals contribute, I mean, as you know, it is very difficult to control. There are different types of birds, animals and other things which comes to the historic structures, especially when they are not in use. So, animals contribute to the ground salt in soil by urinating and defecing. And these are very difficult, because until and unless there is a proper drainage system, not a proper cleaning, they will cause damage to the fabric. And animals cause also abrasion to the building fabric and deposit grease. These are sometimes it is not only very different to look at or damaging to look at, ugly sights, but these are also causing problems to the actual fabric of the historical structures. Another sight which we confront very often is the monkeys, and they cause a lot of problem to the tourist and other, and they are also sometimes given food, and that also because of that they come and settle or try to come near the historic sites, and they can be very destructive, right, removing not only the different things from the tourist and the people, but they also sometimes destructive because they take the some of the tiles and other things which can be removed. We will talk to the animals, and these we also know that it is not only that we have to keep a balance between the animal protection laws and the laws for the historic preservation and the cause of historic preservation. So, we have to be very careful, and they may be sometimes a part of their natural habitat or ecosystem. One has to be very careful about when talking about these causes. Now, birds, especially the pigeons, can cause problem when surfaces become covered with their droppings and nest litter, because when they make the litters, and especially in the corners of the historic structure, they bring certain things which are very combustible material. So, that also are very dangerous. So, as you can see that these are is a picture that how the animal droppings and the pigeon droppings, they are really causing a lot of problem. Not only they can be cleaned, but they, if they stay there longer, they will, as I said, that they will cause a damage to the fabric itself. As you can see that here also the pigeons, their nests are there, and these toxics, because these are generally the toxic and corrosive droppings of pigeon in historic structure. They many a times they sort of react with the building material, and they may cause a certain permanent damage. Because these feces, they generally contain acidic, they are acidic in nature, and depending on which are the material, because some of the metal like aluminum or glass, sometimes they actually cause damage to the surface itself and the fabric itself. In addition to that, I mean, when there is a large accumulation of these feces, they sort of choke the rainwater gutters and downwater pipes, and which again cause a further problem. So, these are all interrelated aspects, and if they are not taken care of, that cause one damage to another damage to another damage to this type. But then what is the solution? One, we must remember the nesting bars are protected by the law, and so some of the animals are. There is a very strict animal control, protection and preservation wildlife law. So, depending on which country where we are working, we have to be very careful, because earlier there were a lot of measures were taken. We are sometimes very cruel, and these are not possible nowadays. So, one has to look into that particular laws to keep a balance between that. So, it is often to kill or disturb the wild birds, especially when the nests are in use, and destroy their eggs. It's a punishable offense. And so, it's more or less like preventive measures what have to be taken care of. Generally, the tourists should not be allowed to feed them, and they also shouldn't do picnic type of things where they bring the eating materials and other, because that sort of attracts many birds and different types of animals. So, this is one of the things which has to be, through proper management, it can be clearly taken care of. And so, the preventing the nesting of the bird, and depending on their breeding season, another one can be careful, so that this does not accumulate to such an extent that it cannot be prevented. This is an example of Kanchipuram, where you can see a newspaper cutting where Boguntu Perumal temple turns a den for bats. Bats is another type of element which is their very favorite spots of the whole historic structure. Why? Because they generally choose the old and the dark buildings, as you can see that they have their nesting pattern or habitat pattern, and they have this pattern. So, there are a lot of researches going on that how to prevent the bat depending on their habitat system and other. So, this is also very important aspects, because they not only create droppings and other things, they are sometimes dangerous, and they cause further damage to the historic fabric, because they can cause a lot of smell and mess of the entire area. So, what is the remedial measure? Especially judicious use of deterrents, especially high intensity ultrasound can mitigate problem caused by bats. There are researches being done that what sort of intensity it can be done. Earlier there were electrocution or other things where there spikes where there, these are not allowed nowadays, and so one has to take something, a measure which does not cause further damage to these animals or birds, different types, but also can take care of the historic fabric. Both are important. So, we have to take a balance between the two, and it is not only just taking some of the measures, one has to, depending on which fabric, where, which type of animals come there, not only the preventive measures, but also take care of the special advice from the expert to see that which type of preventive measures can be applicable in a particular situation. So, so as we see that whether it is in animals or whether it is a pigeons, you can see that how much deterrent to the building fabric it is causing. So, we have to try to minimize any places for the entry of this building. So, sometimes netting and other aspects are also taken care of. ASI has taken many of places this netting, so that the birds and animals cannot enter the thing, because it also sometimes may interfere the aesthetic attribute of the historic structure. So, as I said that there is a balance which has to be taken care of, so that to prevent this does not happen, do not go out of control. So, if they are already present, these animals, either birds, pigeons or monkeys or whatever, they could pose a real health hazard, they are maybe unsafe to the tourist. So, we need to seek a professional advice to remove them depending on where. So, it has to be a multidisciplinary team which has to work depending on that. But it is absolutely necessary that we create a balance, we need to create a balance between these two. And also we have to remember that when cleaning the bats and bird droppings and urine, because we may use something which may ultimately damage the fabric. So, which material, what is the material, what type of detergent we are using, what type of chemical we are using, all are very important. And as I said that it has to be taken through some expert advice. But these are very, very common causes which cause a problem, and until and unless it is immediately taken care of, it can cause a long term negative effect. Let us come to another thing, the insects. Especially the organic materials like wood are most vulnerable to the insect attack. Many of our historic structure has the timber components either in beam, rafters, or different types of furniture, different types of joinery. So, these can the insects of varied types it can cause. One of the example is the wood eating insect, the masonry bees. As you can see that they generally prefer the holes and others, and their propensity to attack the old or badly maintained mortar or cement between the brick or masonry structure. So, when this they are not properly maintained, the cement or the mortar joints, then they have a chance to come, and sometimes they try to in between the tiles or in between some of the cracks or joints, these masonry bees try to make their habitat. The difference is that they do not like, unlike bats and other, they do not stay in a group. They are very individually, they make their own habitat, and they also have their breeding season, and until an unless is taken care of, it can cause a further damage within the fabric. And you can see that here is an adobe wall where bee damage mud wall, we can see that other things, but sometimes it can be only at an upper level. So, it is possible to remove that and make some preventive measure or repair to the damage done. Sometimes it may be far reaching, it is actually making damage to the core of the structure. So, one has to be very careful and do some preventive measures. So, one has to create or make use. So, what they do actually, we have to understand their behavior. What they do is that they create or make use of the existing horizontal or cylindrical holes in which they complete their life cycle, burrow in the soft stone and weak bricks and crumbling mortar joints. So, if the mortar joints are in a good condition, then probably this type of insects cannot make that place their habitat. So, that means that we have to take care not only by netting or preventing them, we have to sort of repair the crumbling mortar joints with proper material, so that they cannot make it their habitat. So, one has to find out the cause, understand their behavior. So, whatever I have just given one example. So, there can be varied types of intake depending on the climate, depending on the place, depending on the local habitat system. So, first is that we have to identify the insect and study the life cycle. So, with the help of the biologist, geologist, depending on the expertise they have, we have to study the life cycle of these insects, and then the specialist advice for the appropriate chemical. This is a very important, that if we need to use some of the chemicals, it is rather not going to a market and buying any chemical and buying them, because we are dealing with a very sensitive fabric. We must be very aware that what we are using and what can be the effect or impact on the historic fabric. Also, we have to understand that sometimes it is very tempting to use some toxic material which are available in the market. We must understand that it can be deterrent or damaging to the human life and to the wildlife. So, these are very, very sort of sensitive issues, though it creates a lot of problem to the and damage to the historic fabric, but as I said, that one has to study very carefully, not take a very hurried decision, and study that and take a proper expert advice, and depending on what is the problem and what can be the cure, one has to go in a sort of a slow caution and take a proper step, and which is of course a long term effect. The other very important thing, and which is quite damaging, is the termite attack. And this is something which is quite dangerous, because sometimes we can't even understand or can't even know that something is happening. So, this is especially the wood effects. You can see that beneath the surface, termite can really deteriorate a historic wooden element component, and especially because termites actually they make a huge colony under the this ground on the surface, and then they climb up, and there is certain particular condition, particular temperature and other or particular component which are more sort of comfortable for them to that. So, we must understand that what are these conditions, what is the temperature and other things, so that it discourage this type of effect. And of course, one must also that there are remedial measures like termite shield which are there. We have to look for the boreholes and sawdust as. So, termites effects which has happened, it does not come certainly there are some indication. One can daily cleaning and other things, people can understand there is some indication and one can take care rather than suddenly finding one day that everything is gone beneath the surface. So, this is why again as I say a specialist advice is required, but what is again more important is to the regular inspection, regular cleaning as a part of the maintenance and management system. Next we will talk about the trees and the plants, and again there are various types and various types of problem. One is the creeping plants. They can damage the machinery if unchecked. As you can see that here the ivy growing on a historic brickwork, they are really putting their roots within the fabric, and some of these old mortar joints are very good sort of good food for the creeper plants. So, they survive on that, and then they put their roots within the joints, and then ultimately not only deteriorate the joint, they actually go much deeper into the surface, and that causes further problem, like not only the blocking the gutters, but sometimes they sort of crumble the mortars, they make deep roots, and sometimes they become so unmanageable that it is very difficult. So, so they drive their roots as I say, crumbling the machinery, causing disintegration of the material. This is and it can be handled if it is detected at a very early age time. If forcibly removed, because if you just want to cut it and forcibly remove it, it can pull off a weak surface of brickwork and plaster. So, one has to be very careful that before taking any action. And one must understand that rather than pulling it off from the surface, one must first kill it and then remove when it has died back. And for killing, what should be the use for the cleaning? Also one should be taking some expert advice that what should be the chemical, what type of things, depending on what is the material or the component, one has to take an expert advice. So, care should be taken when inspecting a creeper or root covered wall. The creeper or roots of tree might possibly be, sometimes it happens that creeper has grown over and we can cut, we see the entire building or the wall crumbles, because it does not have that mortar joint. So, the creeper has actually grown inside and it is actually holding the structure, the wall or the whatever we are talking about. So, if we just remove the creeper without understanding that, it may so happen the entire structure collapses. So, one has to be very careful that what has to be done during this time. So, vigilance, as I said, that one has to be very careful. A regular maintenance management can prevent a structure becoming or in such a horrible state, unmanageable state. So, vigilance and early removal using the appropriate herbicide is very important. Again, I am insisting that it is very important what herbicide to use to give get an expert advice for that. Sometimes it is the huge trees, as I say, that until and unless it starts as a sampling, but ultimately it grows so huge that it becomes very unmanageable. As I say, sometimes it almost is holding and supporting the every structure. Is a small temple, as you can see, it is near in our Midnapur district, East Midnapur district, a temple, very well known temple. It has really almost covered with the trees, and the tree roots have really penetrated within the structure. So, it is very important to understand, first of all, it is do not allow this thing to happen, that is what is important. So, the presence of plants growing in a wall is usually, it is also an indication of a decayed mortar or excess moisture. Until and unless this type of situation happen, they won't grow. So, either the mortar is very weak or there is a huge moisture. So, they are all sort of complementary to each other. So, large plants or shrubs growing at the base of the walls also can be very dangerous, because it traps the moisture and the roots can damage the underground den. Sometimes the roots go so deep underneath that they sort of block the drains, they sometimes cause cracks to the foundation. These are the things which has to be understood, and then before taking any measure. And trees near the buildings can undermine their foundation and also cause the ground heave, because when the trees sort of spread a network under the surface, depending on which soil and where, it also can cause a ground heave, and which again put a thrust on the structure. So, these are all sort of a certain one damage or type of decay happening. This is a snowball effect, it is causing further problem, it is causing further problem. So, until and unless we understand that what is really the issue, and we take a proper care at the initial stage, this sometimes become unmanageable, and we said okay, demolish the structure. Especially in clay soils, tree can withdraw the ground moisture and causing the surrounding soil to shrink, thus causing movement of the foundation and subsequent cracking of the walls. As I say that these are all interrelated, and these has to be checked. It is very important. Again and again I am saying that when a small sapling is coming, sometimes what happen is that if the drain gets blocked and some sort of a dust particles accumulate, sort of a bird brings a sort of a seed, and that seed sort of becomes a sapling, and it can maybe a banyan tree or some other huge tree, and this sapling starts growing, and this not only penetrates the root within the surface, but it also blocks the sort of a flow of water, and these are, as I say, interrelated, and sometimes it becomes so huge and it penetrates the root to such an extent that it is become unmanageable, and then we try to cut the roots, the entire structure collapses. You can see that this is a structure which is really now unmanageable. It is a very important temple, and this was the exterior outer building of that temple, which is does not have roof any longer, but even the wall is in a very difficult state, because depending on the just before the rainy season, if the trees are trimmed or cut or some measures are taken, then it would not have grown. It is a I mean, it is an accumulated effect of years of negligence which is causing this problem, and there may be but just simple measures which can prevent certain these type of things to happen. As I said, it is very difficult to remove trees which are deeply rooted and in structure, because they sort of entwine the entire structure and holding the entire structure, and ultimately it becomes like a neglected in ruins, and it will fall one day, and we won't have any measure to take care of this type of thing. In this category also comes the bacteria, lichens, mosses and fungi. It's a huge family, and as I can see there, this is the terracotta temples of Maluti in Jharkhand, beautiful groups of 100 temples, more than 100, and they are on a tentative list, World Heritage list. It's in the Jharkhand border, and this is another picture that where the mosses and fungi are sort of affecting the timber surface. As I say, these mosses, fungi, lichens and bacteria, there are various species, various categories, various types, and each has their own favorable habitat, favorable environment, and also their remedial measures also vary. And until and unless we really specifically know, so we need the expert advice depending on which type and which species. It can be tested, and they have their pores, and these pores can lie dormant for some time, and they can sort of, depending on the environmental condition, they again can sprout. So, I will just give a brief introduction to this category. the bacterial lichens produce acid, and this is quite dangerous, which react chemically with the building materials. And it is not only that it looks bad, but just to caution of cleaning it, but actually it reacts chemically with the material component and the fabric, and which is something which is quite alarming. So, algae moss and lichen produce the humus in which larger and more damaging plants can grow. As I say that they are all interrelated. So, they produce something and on which the other plants sort of grow, and then they give the roots. So, it is all interlinked. A build-up of this can cause retention of moisture in the building, which is again, as we talked about the moisture and how it can be very damaging for the entire fabric. You can see that not only these places are covered with the lichens and other things, there are also the trees and other things, saplings are growing on the roof, and ultimately it will cause that roofing system to crack, and the roots will penetrate and the moisture will develop. So, there will be a water seepage, ultimately it becomes an unmanageable things. As you can see that this is a beautiful a small temple near Pashkura in Bengal, West Bengal, and on the roof of the temple is actually a Rashmansha. It's a beautiful terracotta figurine, and which has an influence of the European influence. You can see the dress and other things, the figures, and it is totally damaged by the moss, fungi and other types, and depending on the weather it will again sprout and it will become active. So, the fungi, mildew, molds and ears, they do not need sunlight. One must understand that they also, as I say, they have their own habitat. We also know the wood is particularly at risk from dry and wet rot fungus. So, we have to understand some of the principles that which type of environment is suitable for them. So, that we have to ensure that this does not happen. And dry rot fungus attack generally the dry root, it has its own moisture source, and wet rot fungus needs a moisture content of 25% before it attacks the wood. So, again I am saying that it is just a very cursory introduction, but one has to understand that what are the favorable condition and see that this does not happen. What is important is to be careful when use the fungicides and weed killers. It's again and again I am saying it's very easy to go and buy something and use the fungicide, but it can also be damaging to the building materials and a very precious fabric which probably irreversible. So, one need a specialist advice and see that what is the maintenance and management policy. As I say, sometimes a regular maintenance management, and with some of the good expert advice, it is very sort of easy sometimes to keep the building or the historic fabric, preserve it in its existing state, not allow these type of aspects, animals or plants to, as I say, they are interrelated, to take the fabric to such a state that there is no going back. As I say that one has to inhibit the growth, the spraying with proper treatment material, proper chemical, then after that brushing and treatment under an expert advice. These are important, and these can be taken as from the expert and taken as a maintenance, regular maintenance policy and used. I have used mainly Sir Bernard Fielding's guidelines for conservation for this part and this reference. So, we have briefly discussed the biological and the botanical causes and the animals and different types of fungus and what they can do, the type of damage. As I say that they are all interrelated factors. Some of the major causes of decay which can happen and which can be prevented and taken care of, and one has to think about a proper balance between the human life, the visitors, the maintenance of the historical fabric, the protection of the animals. So, there are very laws and very many laws that, so we have to take a balanced view, and with the proper expert advice and proper maintenance policy, this is possible to keep the historic fabric in a proper state. So, next lecture we will talk about other types of decay, what damages the historic fabric.